Hello again. So this is lesson 10 in the course for writing task 1 for the academic module of the IELTS test. And this is the last lesson on the specific types of questions that you'll find in task 1 on the academic test. So the remaining 2 lessons are on how to prepare for the test and on vocabulary that you can use in the test. But this is the last one. We're going to talk about a specific type of question, processes, diagrams, and how you answer that specific type of question. Again, this is somewhat similar to a maps question in that you will be describing the information that you see. You won't be talking about data and numbers and things like this. You'll simply be talking about changes, or in this case, stages. So you'll need to describe all of the stages in a process or on a diagram, and you can essentially think of these as the same diagram process. Some people even consider maps, diagrams, processes all to be in the same category. I think maps are a category by themselves, whereas diagrams and processes are basically very, very similar. So again, describing all the stages in a process or a diagram and having an overview, which is a bit different than the data question. So again, describing the type of process that you see. And one other common point with the maps questions is that you'll be using the passive sum to describe what happened, because that's how this kind of information is described in English. One other thing to note about diagrams and processes question, which is fairly unique, is you'll have an extensive use of sequencing language. Because again, you're talking about steps in a process. So first, then, after that, words and phrases like this that show us, the order that the stages go in are important for this particular question type. As far as the structure goes, 4 paragraphs works well for this question type like it does for the others. The first paragraph is your introduction. What type of process are we looking at? What type of process is presented in the question? The second one is your overview there. Again, this is a bit different for this type of question. What you need to describe is the type of process depicted in the question. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we look at a specific example. And then the details paragraphs, again, going through the stages. It may be very clear where you divide the process and talk about one part in one paragraph and the other part in the other paragraph. There may be some flexibility. It might be kind of random, but essentially dividing the information into 2 different details paragraphs shows that you can logically paragraph, which is important, and also allows you to break up the information so it's a little bit easier to follow the description for the examiner and a little bit easier for you to keep track of when you're in the exam. So life cycle of the silkworm. So if I look at this, I think, what are the main things that happen? So for this particular one, we can see 1, 2, 3, 4. They've mentioned the 4 stages. So that's something we can say. The life cycle of a silkworm is a 4-stage process that begins with 1, the laying of eggs, and ends with the hatching of a moth. Something like that. That's enough to give the general idea. We'll go into more detail in our details paragraph, but just what type of process it is. And for this particular one, if we look at the second process, production of silk cloth, I would use a second sentence. Production of silk cloth, on the other hand, 1, 2, 3, 4, is a 5-stage process that begins with selecting silk and ends with the dyeing and weaving of the fabric. Something like that. Dyeing and weaving of the cloth. Again, so you're starting at the beginning of whatever stage it is, talking about you can mention how many steps or stages it has if that's easy. And then kind of talking about the beginning and end. That's a very easy way to describe the overview for a process. Now, normally, more typical question, like the one I'm going to go over in the lesson, will have simply one process and a few more steps, right? So the amount of information that you have to report is about the same, but it's actually just one process. Again, this is, in a way, it's a little bit like a multiple graph question in that you've got 2 different diagrams or processes which are related to each other, but you don't have to connect them together. Again, this is an older question, but what you have to do in this is exactly the same as what you have to do in any diagram or process question, and that is describe what type of process it is in the overview, and then go over the details in the details paragraph. So a logical way to divide this would be the first paragraph is about the life cycle of the silkworm. Again, all of this vocabulary you should use because you're probably not going to think of synonyms for this, and doing that, even if it were correct, would probably be pretty confusing. So again, use the diagram labels when you're describing the process and describe everything in the process. So you've got to describe this stage to here, you know, the first stage to the second stage to the third stage to the fourth stage. And you know, some of the variety of vocabulary that you can use will come up with, you know, how you describe what happens between the stages. Don't be thinking of synonyms for things in the process. Our second details paragraph is essentially just describing a similar thing for the production of silk cloth. All of these different stages, again, using the vocabulary that they give you and also mixing that with your own way to describe what happens in between those things. The main thing that you have to do is describe the processes clearly, use the vocabulary that's presented to you, and then make sure you divide the information clearly into two different details paragraphs, and make sure you go through the sequence in a logical way. And we'll see that in the next question that we have a look at. So here's a process question about making bricks from IELTS.org. If you look at the directions, the diagram below shows the process by which bricks are manufactured for the building industry. There's our first paragraph stating that in a slightly different way. Might be a good idea to pause the recording, have a look at the process, think about how you would divide it, how could you summarize the overall process, and then, you know, think about the vocabulary that's provided in the question, how that needs to be used, and other ways you would describe things. When you're ready to check, unpause your video. So there's quite a lot of vocabulary here. Again, digger, clay, metal grid, roller, sand and water, wire cutter. You should be using all of this vocabulary in your report because that's the clearest way to express these concepts. Occasionally you'll see the asterisk below clay, type of sticky earth that is used for making bricks, pots, etc. So if they use some vocabulary they think that most people won't know, they'll include a brief definition of that. So how could you divide this material? What type of process is it? Okay, so it's a synthetic process. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stages or many stages. It starts digging up clay and ends with delivery of the products. The manufacturing process is what happens in between. So we could describe that. That's generally our overview. In terms of the details paragraphs, there's some flexibility here. Just, you know, if there's not a really logical way to do it, just kind of divide it evenly, so you half of the stages in one details paragraph, half the stages in the other details paragraph. That will make it easier for the examiner to keep track of what you're saying, and also for you to keep track of the details as you're presenting them. So something like this, maybe, you know, from the digger to the drying oven, or from the digger to the mold, that's one half, and then the kiln or the drying oven starts the second half. You know, I've seen a report where the person did the whole process, so from digger to the mold to the drying oven to the drying process in one paragraph, and then packaging and delivery in another paragraph. Logically, that's fine, that makes sense. And you know, they had one quite long paragraph and one quite short paragraph. That's also acceptable. The reason why I would try to break it up a little more evenly is, like I said, it's easier for the examiner to keep track of what you're saying, what you're writing about, and it's easier for you to keep track of the details in your own mind if you kind of include more equal amounts of information in each part, in each details paragraph. Again, that's up to you, and there are many different ways you can do this. So let's have a look at the report, and keep in mind the vocabulary. So if you look below the report, there's another version with highlighted vocabulary in purple and blue, and a lot of this is what I mentioned, like describing sort of what happens between the pictures and other ways to describe what's happening in the pictures used in connection with the vocabulary that's presented in the diagram. Again, you need to use that. Thinking of synonyms will generally just make it confusing and is extremely difficult, if not impossible. So think about how vocabulary is used in this particular one. So the diagram illustrates the manufacturing process for making bricks for use in the building industry. Again, if you look at the question, it's a paraphrase of that. The production of bricks is a multi-stage process, beginning with the processing of raw materials and ending with the packaging and delivery of bricks for use in building construction. So again, I've just described sort of the beginning and end of the process. I've said multi-stage, it's a 7-step process. The main thing is to give kind of an idea about just characterize what the process is. Like, how does it start? How does it end? Okay, let's look at our first details paragraph. And again, pay attention to the vocabulary. The process begins with the excavation of clay from underground. After this, the clay is deposited on a metal grid and sifted onto a roller below the grid, which transports the material to be mixed with sand and water to form the mixture from which bricks are formed. Following this point, bricks are shaped by one of two methods, using either a wire cutter to slice the mixture or a mold which forms them into shape. So a mold, vocabulary from the question, forms them into shape, what it does. Wire cutter slices the mixture, again, what it does. Other words like deposited on, sifted onto, material, mixed with, mixture, form. So these are all words that are used to describe the process in connection with the words that are provided for you. This can be why task 1 is a bit tricky for vocabulary, because all of the sort of really good vocabulary they give you, and so you need to think a little bit. But again, the main important factor in your score is going to be using language accurately and appropriately. And you've only got 20 minutes, so just, keep it in mind, but don't obsess over your vocabulary or you'll run into trouble. The other thing to think about is, sequencing language. So you need sequencing language in this type of question. Begins with, after this, following this point, next, followed by, final, etc. So second paragraph, we start here with the drying oven. That's as logical a place as any to begin. Next, the bricks begin the drying process, which starts when the bricks are placed in a drying oven. After a period of 24 to 48 hours, they are then moved to a two-step kiln process where they are first fired under moderate heat, followed by high heat of 870 to 1300 degrees. After resting in a cooling chamber for 48 to 72 hours, the bricks are packaged and readied for final delivery to the construction industry. So there's a complete description. I've described every step and stage which I need to do, described all of the little pictures in the process. If you look at the vocabulary I supplied, drying process, placed in a period of moved to two-step process, fired under heat, resting, packaged and readied. So they've said packaging, I've said packaged, construction industry. So there's plenty of variety of vocabulary there. I've described all the processes, I've described all the stages of the process. Everything is clear. It's really pretty simple, actually. Often when people see maps questions and process or diagrams questions, they think, that looks horrible, because they've never done something like that before. But once you've done it a few times, it's really easy. It's so straightforward. You just have to describe everything that's there, and if you do that, you'll do a great job if you follow, the principles of the course. So again, if you look below, you will see this second version with cohesive devices, referencing devices, and useful vocabulary. Useful vocabulary. So I would have a look at that. And again, especially for process questions, paying attention to the way that the vocabulary from the question is incorporated as it needs to be, but also pay attention to the other vocabulary which you're going to have to provide yourself. That should be related to your level of English and your ability to communicate. And again, you should focus clearly on communicating your ideas clearly and accurately with appropriate language that you know well. And if you do that, and your level of English is about where it needs to be, then you should do fine for this type of question or any other. There's the lesson on diagram and process questions. Hopefully it was useful. As with any type of Task 1 question, make sure that you get adequate practice answering these types of questions. Get your work checked. Make sure that there aren't any issues. And if you do that, diagram and process questions are really easy to answer. And if you get one on exam day, you'll probably be happy that you did.